Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful, creepy little human being, you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's Morbid makeup video. I'm so happy we could meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow, in all of this craziness today, you and I were able to find each other on this crazy planet that we all call home. My name is Brittany or Braderstein, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing the Powell family. We're going to be discussing the disappearance of Susan Powell. We're going to be discussing the aftermath of that disappearance and the evidence against her husband, Josh Powell. We're going to be discussing the subsequent murder-suicide, where in 2012, Joshua Powell murdered Susan's two sons, two young boys, and then killed himself. We're going to be discussing a lot of information about Josh and a lot of information about his family. And this is part 2, by the way. If you did not see part 1, you should watch that first because, you know, it came first. And if you want to get some backstory on these people and the characters, because if you haven't, you might miss something. And it's very important because all of these people are very important and interesting. So make sure to check that out. But today we're getting into the nitty-gritty and it's going to be a long one. I just know it. I just know it. Just in case you're new and you don't know, this is actually my very first time doing a 2-part series. Most of my videos are just one long video on a case, but this one just had way too much information and this is like my case, so I couldn't leave anything out. Every single thing felt very important and necessary, so that is why it's a 2-parter. Let me know if you guys like that down below, because I don't know. Do you guys like series? Do you want just really long videos? Let me know. We're trying something out here. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing the bell because I put out a new Morbid makeup video every single week and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you. So I'd love it if you would do those things and, you know, join us and become one of us. One of us. One of us. One of us. And also if you wanted to follow me on Instagram and Twitter, they're both Braderstein, whatever. And now that we're done with that pesky but totally necessary self-promotion, I think I should just jump straight into the video because I've already made you wait a couple days. So let's do it. Come. Gather around and let me tell you the second half of the Powell family story, the heartbreaking ending. On the snowy Monday morning, December 7th, 2009, Charlie and Braden, Josh and Susan Powell's sons, were due at daycare like they did every single Monday. They always got there at the same time. Susan Powell was a big creature of habit. And when the boys did not arrive like they were supposed to, the daycare teacher or provider, or I don't know what, daycare instructor, she got worried and so she called the Powell home and received no answer. Concerned because this was very unlike the family, particularly Susan, the daycare provider decided, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and call their works. I don't wanna freak out, but like, I'm gonna call and see what's up. So she called both Susan and Josh's works and found that they had been no call, no shows at work that day. And she was like, okay, this is a problem. So she ended up actually driving over to the house. This woman is a hero, okay? And she drove over to the house and she found that the car was not in the driveway, and nobody was inside answering the door. So the daycare provider, worried, decided, okay, I'm gonna call the emergency contact. So the family's emergency contact was Josh's sister, Jennifer, which if you remember from the last video, most of Josh's family, batshit crazy. But Jennifer was like the one that stuck with the mom and was completely, she's like a normal person somehow. She got out of that family and not crazy. So she calls Jennifer, and this woman, this daycare provider, just had such good intuition. She reminds me of Shanann Watts' friend Nicole, who like got to the house and immediately knew something was wrong. To be honest, this case reminds me so much of the Watts case when I like think about them side by side, but anyway. By 10 a.m. that morning, police were at the house trying to figure out what to do, and they ended up actually just going into the house, even though this isn't something they would normally do. Sometimes, you know, they're worried about being sued, but they decided to go in and make sure that the family wasn't inside and incapacitated. So they go in and everything looks relatively normal. The only thing that's like a little odd is that there's a couple of fans that are set up on the floor, and they're pointing directly at a wet spot on the carpet and a wet spot on the couch, and that the family was just nowhere to be found. Everybody's gone. Everything looks normal except for that. And the fact that Susan's purse with her debit cards, her ID, everything that like a woman would need when she's out of the house was left in the house. So this started to look weird because as a mother and like a woman, you are always going to take all your stuff first off. And then the family's just like gone and they don't tell anyone. And since they were such a strictly routine family, people were worried immediately. So police start immediately looking into this because in addition to the weirdness of like the family just being missing, the box fans being pointed at a wet spot, Susan's purse being left. There had also been snow the night before, because this was Utah in December, and bro, if you've never been to Utah, I mean, I'm from Southern California, so my gauge for cold is pretty skewed, but Utah is so cold. I went in October once, and no, too cold. But so that it had snowed, and there were no tire tracks in the snow that showed that the family had left that morning, so they had been gone all night. And this was odd, so they started to call hospitals and things like that to make sure that they hadn't been in some sort of accident, and they started calling all of the family's friends to try to find out when somebody last heard from or saw the Powells. This is when the police came upon a woman named Giovanna, and Giovanna was a friend of the family. She was a friend of Susan's, and she had actually seen the family the day before, that Sunday, and not only had she seen them, but she had been inside the Powell home, and she was like chilling with Susan. She had been at the house hanging out with Susan. The two had ate some pancakes that Josh had made for them, which was like very odd because Josh never did anything like nice or helpful, so it was noteworthy that he had actually cooked for them. And then a little bit after they ate, Susan started to not feel very well, so she went to lay down, and Giovanna just kind of like hung out, which I don't know, maybe they were good friends, but like I wouldn't be down if somebody just hung out at my house when I went to lay down. And after a bit, Josh was kind of like, I need to get out, like I gotta go, I got stuff to do. She had kind of overstayed. As Giovanna left, she noted that Josh took both boys, Charlie and Braden, loaded them into the family van, and the three drove off together. Now, in preparation for this video, I listened to the Cold podcast. I actually listened to it twice, and if this is a case that after I'm done telling it, you find that you are going to be as obsessed with it as I am, I highly suggest this podcast because, my God, hours upon hours of information. Like, cutting it down for myself was incredibly difficult, but in the Cold podcast, they discuss a theory. They discuss a theory where, okay, so Josh never did anything nice for Susan, right? But this day he happened to make her pancakes, and right after, she started to feel sick. And remember, she had been feeling sick recently. She thought she was pregnant and she was gonna get that blood test. So there's a theory that perhaps Josh had been poisoning Susan for quite some time. But again, allegedly, this is just a theory. But it's an interesting one to consider. So police and friends, everyone had been trying to call Josh and Susan on their cell phones all day, as I'm sure you can imagine, and no one could get a hold of anyone until Josh finally answered his phone. And when Josh answered his phone, everybody, you know, like the normal questions popped in, like, hello, where are you? What's going on? Everyone's worried. Are you okay? Right? The police are here, blah, blah, blah. So Josh says that he's out just driving with the boys and he'll be back soon. And when they're like, well, where's Susan? Is Susan with you? He's like, nah, dog, Susan's at work. And then when they're like, bro, no, she's not at work, like, we've already checked that, he just says that he does not know where she is. So everyone's waiting at the Powell home. He says he's on his way back, and the minutes tick, 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 no Josh. And so they start calling him again and again and again, and he doesn't answer, and they notice that his phone's going from being turned on to going straight to voicemail. And his sense of urgency here just was not where it should be, especially since, hello, Josh, this is kind of a frantic situation. The cops are at your house. Your wife is missing. And I found out that when police later looked into his cell phone records, what happened was when he got the phone call, he was near the house. And when he found out everybody was at the house and worried, he drove the other direction instead of going home. Like a totally innocent person would, obviously. So when Josh finally does get home, immediately the cops start questioning him. They've been waiting a while. They're tired of waiting. So they're like, yo, where were you? Where is Susan? What's going on? Why aren't you answering your phone? Susan and her phone are both missing. What's up? And he was like, I don't know where Susan or her phone are. And my phone, I kept turning it off because the battery was gonna die and I don't have a charger, right? But Josh wasn't too smart because there's a charger sitting in the front seat in plain view of the officer where he can see it, so they know he's lying and acting super sketchy. So they take Josh in for questioning, and he is generally unhelpful and seems completely uninterested. When Josh was asked when he had last seen his wife Susan, he said that he had last seen her at midnight the night before when he randomly got the amazing idea of, hey, you know what sounds great? I'm gonna go camping tonight with my two small children at 1:30 in the morning in December in Utah. It's cold. It had snowed that night, remember? And Josh was like, yeah, perfect time for camping with two small children. And Susan was like, Yeah, go. Have some quality time with your kids. I'm totally okay with that. This is his story. Which, I mean, doubt it, but okay. Go off, Josh. When asked why there were fans set up in the living room, Josh was like, okay, Susan, she's a neat freak. She wanted me to immediately clean the couch and the floor in the middle of the night because it was dirty. Sure, reasonable. I guess, why not? And he then said goodnight to her, she went to bed, and he decided to pack up the van to go on a camping trip. He packed up all the camping essentials, except for a tent. He didn't bring a tent. Okay, and then he got in his car and he made the 2-hour drive to the camping location with 2 small kids in the snow with no tent. So police were like, okay, why did you decide to go on a camping trip when you had work the next morning? And you didn't even call to let them know you weren't coming. You were just like a no-call, no-show. And Josh said that he was confused on the day. He was under the impression that it was actually Saturday night, not Sunday night. So he thought he didn't have work the next day, and he didn't realize what the day was until the next morning when he woke up with the boys at the camping site. Josh said that once he realized what the day was, he decided to just say, screw it. He didn't hurry home. He didn't call work and like tell them like, sorry for the mistake. I got my days confused and I'm far away from home. He just decided to like wake up and make s'mores with his boys and then just go around his day like nothing had even happened. And he didn't even call home to find out, like to let Susan know what was going on. Like I would imagine a married couple would. He didn't even call to find out how Susan was going to get to work that day, considering it had snowed, and he took the only family car. And side note, ooh, this motherfucker. The family only had the one car, right? So Susan would often ride her bike to work because Josh kept the car, and her work wasn't particularly close. I don't know if she chose to do this or not, but this is what happened. So with him knowing that it snowed when he woke up in the morning, knowing what the day of the week was, he didn't even bother to call and check on how his wife got to work. Didn't care. Nothing. No sense of urgency. It just doesn't make any sense. So police did a search of the van, and inside they found the camping equipment, San's tent. Homeboy literally didn't pack a tent. And also in the car they found Susan's missing cell phone. It had been shoved in the center console all the way down at the bottom under a bunch of stuff with the SIM card removed. Totally not sketchy at all. Despite all of this weirdness, despite Josh's lies, despite the fact that this literally made no sense, police made a pretty big mistake here, and they let Josh and the boys go home to that house that night. They didn't search the house beforehand. They didn't preserve what could have been a crime scene, and they literally let Josh and his kids go home that night, and it was a big mistake because Josh spent that night and all of the next morning deep cleaning his house and his car. Josh even had a scheduled appointment with police to come back without the boys so that they could question him further without interruptions, and Josh was late because he was still busy cleaning his home. So during the questioning, Josh was super vague with his answers. When asked about Susan, he said that he didn't believe that she would leave alone. He said right away that he wanted an attorney because he felt that police were suspecting him or thought that he was involved. Police even went as far as to actually read him his Miranda rights, which, the way I understand it, maybe this is just California law, but I don't believe you even legally have to read the Miranda rights to somebody unless they're being questioned and arrested. And he wasn't arrested yet, but they did it anyway. I think they just kind of wanted to be safe because they did suspect him. Which, I mean, why wouldn't they? So Josh asked the police, like, am I under arrest or am I free to go? And they're like, you're free to go if you really want to go and you don't want to help find your wife, like whatever. And he's like, peace. He jumps at the opportunity to leave, but as he's leaving, police inform him, yo, you can go, but we're confiscating your van and you need to give us your cell phone right now. So Josh hands over his cell phone, but before giving it to police, he had managed to remove his SIM card, just like with Susan's phone. So, in addition to Josh being questioned, so were his 2 children, but since they were such small boys at the time, they had to bring in specialists that specialized in questioning kids of this age and extracting useful information. So the issue is, even with specialists coming in, kids' testimonies, even if they say something that sounds like it could be of interest, they're not particularly reliable, especially at that age, because they don't remember things like in a chronological order, sort of the way adults do. So they may say something very interesting about camping, like I believe that the boys said that their mom was actually there, but they could be remembering any other camping trip and not being able to, they wouldn't be able to distinguish the times or express themselves in a way that made it sound like it was solid evidence. So even though they got some interesting things from the boys, I think particularly from the older boy, Charlie, it wasn't something that could actually be used against Josh and be strong and not be able to be completely just like torn apart by a defense attorney. So police start to investigate, and naturally now they want to search the recently deep cleaned Powell home. And though Josh had done his very best, like he really put in the work to hide any forensic evidence, they were able to recover a little bit, and that was that there was a bit of blood spatter. When they tested the blood, it was a match for Susan, but the problem was that the blood wasn't substantial. It wasn't enough blood to indicate that like a violent attack had happened, just enough to show that at some point a tiny amount of blood had come out of Susan, which could have happened at any time. I mean, she lived there, she could have had a nosebleed, it could have been anything. However, the thing that I find to be noteworthy is, you remember how there were the box fans that were pointing at the newly cleaned couch? The place where the blood was found was the place that had been recently cleaned. So police start doing their due diligence and really looking into the electronics, because when they searched the house, they confiscated a bunch of Josh's electronics because, like I said, this guy was really techie, so he had a bajillion computers, and they start looking into those. And we're going to get a little more into that later, but they also decide they're going to go to Susan's work and question her coworkers, look at her office, all that jazz. And when they do that, they realize that they're probably on the right path with their suspicion of Josh Powell. At Susan's place of employment, they found that will that Susan had written that she hid from Josh at her office, which if you didn't see part 1, we discussed that a little bit, so I would highly suggest looking into that. They also found a safe deposit box that Susan kept, and inside the safe deposit box, she put a lot of stuff that just didn't sit quite right now that she was missing. She put that video that we discussed in part 1 with where she documented all their assets, paperwork that showed she was interested in getting a divorce, and also the paperwork showing that Josh was the beneficiary if anything was to happen to her. It was just like a slew of evidence that showed that she thought something was going to happen to her, or that the marriage wasn't as good as maybe people thought. And there was also writing in there that just showed that Susan was becoming increasingly scared of her husband, Josh Powell, and that she was just scared of what he was capable of. While all of this was happening, no one really knows what Josh was doing. He had went out and got himself a replacement cell phone. He had also got himself a rental car. Even though the police told him that he'd be able to get his van back, he actually never went and picked it back up, probably because he suspected that they were going to be putting like a bug on it, which he was right. But he went and got a rental car and had somehow managed to put 1,000 miles on his rental car. 1,000 unaccounted for miles. He said that he was just driving around aimlessly trying to clear his head. So Josh looks sketchy, right? It just gets sketch and it stays sketch. With the SIM card being taken out of his phone, him getting that rental car and never picking up his van, which I mean, it's probably because he knew they were going to try to track him, but still, he wasn't cooperating with police and didn't come in and take the lie detector test. He was hesitant about giving police anything useful. He ended up pulling his children out of daycare so that his family could be the ones to watch his kids, which was just like a lot all at once. And if that's not bad enough, less than 2 weeks after Susan went missing, Josh went and pulled money out of her accounts and then upped and moved from Utah to Washington to be with his family, which maybe he wanted support if you want to be on the Josh is innocent train, but like your wife has barely been missing. You don't want to stay home in case she comes back. Like you don't want to stay in the home. You want to leave the state. That doesn't look good, especially when it's combined with all of the other things that just did not look good about Josh Powell. And dare I say that that's because he knew she wasn't coming back, allegedly. Josh says a lot of things when questioned by police, but what he really loved to do was try to like badmouth Susan and change like the perception that police had of her, which is just like, it's a shitty thing to do, obviously. He was just trying to deter any suspicion away from him. He was unsuccessful. Like they were suspicious of him the entire time, but you know, he put his best foot forward. He tried his hardest. The one time in Josh's life that he actually tries at something. Josh essentially said that Susan was a bad Mormon, that she wasn't as into her faith as everyone thought, and that she was a sexually repressed person who just hid all of this because she had grown up in the faith, so she wanted to like put on airs, and also because her family, her parents apparently, according to Josh, had been very abusive to her growing up, and so she didn't want to let them down because it was just in her to be an obedient daughter to avoid being abused. Yeah, this was something that Josh and his father Steve said to the media quite often after Susan disappeared. They loved to talk about the fact that Susan's parents were abusive to her and that her childhood journals, you know, the ones that Steve had taken, were proof of this and had evidence of this abuse, and that somehow this factored into her disappearing now, because they said their theory was that she just left on her own to go off with some dude and fulfill all of her sexual fantasies, which, okay. But either way, these people just loved to like hurt Susan's parents. Like, it just makes me so frustrated. And on the subject of those journals, Susan's parents wanted these journals. Their daughter was missing. Josh and his family were not letting Susan's parents see their grandsons. So they lost like their daughter and their grandsons all in one fell swoop. So they wanted Susan's journals so they had something of her, something written by her, something from her life. But Josh refused to give these to her parents and instead let his creepy, nasty father keep them. So speaking of Steve, Josh wasn't the only member of the Powell family that police were interested in. And speaking to Susan's friends and coworkers, they found out about Steve Powell, Josh's dad's unhealthy obsession with his daughter-in-law. And this was very interesting to police. So police head to Washington to question Steve. Not only to question Steve, they were also going to talk to Susan's parents because that's where they lived as well. But I mean, they were pretty interested in Steve. I mean, who wouldn't be when you learned all the stuff about him? And when they talked to Steve, they found he was not shy about talking about his infatuation with Susan. He thought this was totally normal, and he thought that the attraction was mutual, so he had no issue telling them all about it. Steve Powell felt that he and Susan were destined and inevitable. He says that the two never kissed and never had sex, but that there was such an intense desire between the two of them that when he had given her a massage, he could feel that it was a sexually erotic experience for both of them. He said that they were in love and that they couldn't help it, which was weird because, like, Susan never included Steve in any of her journals. This man that was her destined lover. Side note, because I know some of you may not have seen part 1 and you're just like, you know what, you've told me to watch it, but I'm not going to do it, and that's fine. Your choice is your prerogative. But just so you know what I'm talking about, because I keep mentioning these journals, all three actually, not both. Susan, Steve, and Josh were all avid journal keepers. This is something that Susan was brought up in. It's something that's pretty big in the Mormon church. It's important to keep journals about your life, all of your experiences, to show your ancestors. It also, I guess, sort of makes sense for Josh and Steve because at one point they were, you know, practicing Mormons. I mean, now Steve is like, at this point, Steve was a pretty big anti-Mormon and anti-religion in general, but I mean, old habits die hard sometimes. So they all kept journals. In addition to the physical, like, written journals, Josh kept a lot of voice recorded journals, and Steve did a lot of video journaling. Real cringe video journaling. Carry on with the regularly scheduled programming here. So speaking of these journals, police wanted to get them away from Josh and Steve Powell for many reasons, but one big one was that they were using these journals as to sort of create a smear campaign against the Coxes, and they were just making a lot of noise with them, and police wanted to get their hands on them, but they didn't have any legal recourse to get them, so they came up with something a little sneaky, to be honest, and they told Chuck Cox, Susan's dad, without telling Chuck Cox, Susan's dad, that they should set up a honk and wave for Susan, you know, where they go somewhere and they wear their little t-shirts with Susan's name, something so that people can remember Susan, and hold up signs so that people could honk and, you know, bring attention to Susan and remind people that she was still missing. And they decided to do this at the Fred Meyer grocery store that Steve and Josh shopped at. Okay? Now, if you don't know what Fred Meyer is and you're from, like, my neck of the woods, it is like Ralph's and Food for Less. They're all owned by Kroger. Fred Meyer is as well. Fred Meyer's cooler though. I went to a Fred Meyer in Oregon and they're pretty cool. They have everything. It's like a Walmart and a grocery store in one. Anyway, at this time, Josh actually had a restraining order against Chuck Cox, which we'll get into at the end. It's not super important. But so they were not violating the restraining order, but they were kind of like tipping their toe right on that line by doing this. But I think it's kind of funny, to be honest. Mostly just because I don't like the Powells. So naturally, the Powells saw this and decided to show up. The first to get there was Steve Powell, and he was just, you know, angry and argumentative. Like, he wasn't dumb. He knew that they were there to kind of antagonize him, so he went in, he was pissed. He's like, what are you doing here? How is this helping? Why are you at our store? Blah, 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 blah. And this blabbermouth just couldn't help talking about the Coxes, the journals, Susan, how there was vital information in these journals that showed that these people were just monsters and that they were very important to the investigation, which was what the police needed him to say. And all of this was on live TV, or I don't know if it was live, but it was recorded for the news. And you can see these videos online. They're on YouTube. They are accessible. Accessible? Accessible. And because of Steve Powell saying that these journals contained vital information, just like the police needed them to. A couple days later, they actually got a search warrant for Steve's house to retrieve these, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. During this interview, Josh showed up as well, and he was, you know, all teary-eyed and whining and like, why are you doing this to me? You know, whatever. And he had brought his boys with him, and the Coxes had their family with them, and they had a couple of Charlie and Braden's cousins, these little girls, and they asked if they could see their cousin. They hadn't seen Charlie and Braden in forever, and Josh and his dad said no. They wouldn't let these little girls see their cousin. Dicks. So in addition to police being interested in Josh and Steve Powell, they were also interested in one more member of the Powell family. This was Josh's brother, Michael, because apparently 2 weeks after Susan disappeared, Michael had had his car towed to a junkyard. Sorry, I went brain dead for a second. And so the reason this was particularly weird is because, first off, there was like nothing actually wrong with his car. And though there were junkyards that were a lot closer that his car could have been towed to, he requested specifically that it get towed to this specific junkyard that was about 100 miles away, which is weird. So in addition to the car being taken to a tow yard that was super far away, Michael accepted basically like no money for it, even though there was nothing actually wrong with his car, which seems super weird, especially when you think about how close in proximity in time this was to Susan's disappearance. So unfortunately for Michael, the car wasn't destroyed right away, like I'm sure he probably suspected that it would be. So police were actually able to recover it, and when they brought in a cadaver dog, the dog hit on the car's trunk. Unfortunately, though, for us, no real useful information was found in this car, which just like sucks. So eventually, police had actually just exhausted all of their efforts in trying to get any information from Josh and his family because they were just being completely unhelpful and not very forthcoming with information. And in addition to this and how weird Josh had been acting, and I forgot to mention in the beginning, but when Josh first talked to his sister on the phone when the police were waiting for him to come back to the house, his sister Jennifer, the one who was the family's emergency contact, had asked Josh, like, where is Susan? And he said in response, well, what do you know? Okay. So police actually ended up putting wiretaps on Josh's phones, but this didn't bring them anything useful either. This is probably because Josh's brother Michael was like really smart and had warned his family that the police were probably going to be listening in on the calls, and oftentimes when they would be talking on the phone, they would remind each other like, hey, don't say anything crazy because the police might be listening, which if you're innocent, like what are you worried about saying? You know what I mean? Like, it makes me nuts. It makes me fucking nuts. Even though they weren't getting anything useful, police still listened intently, particularly when there were like public searches for Susan or after the honkin' wave. They like listened to be like, what are they saying about it? But they were just really, really careful, the Powells, to not slip up and say anything on the phone that could get them in trouble. They were not shy, however, about speaking so disrespectfully about Susan. I've read some of the transcripts of the things that they said on the phones, and these people just clearly had no respect for her, didn't like her, and like didn't really care that she was gone, which is just so sad, dude. This was her family, and it just breaks my heart. I feel so bad for her. Anyways, in August of 2011, police took their search warrant over to Steve Powell's house to retrieve those journals. Let's put it on my little snail because my hand is too glittery. The journals weren't the only thing that the police had the authority to retrieve at this search warrant. I wanted to try to find the list because on a search warrant you have to list specifically like what you're looking for, but I imagine just based on what they took, it was anything that may be under the umbrella of something that could pertain to Susan and her case. But I couldn't find this list. I wanted to find it and I looked for it, but I could not locate it. So they made everybody who was inside the house go outside while they conducted their search. And fun fact for you, on the day of the search, Steve just happened to be called away to like a job interview or like some sort of job hours away, so he wasn't home at the time of the search. And though police have never like come out specifically and said that they had anything to do with it, they probably had something to do with it. So he wasn't there during the search. So police found a lot during the search, but besides the normal things that you would expect, paperwork, hard drives, computers, things that they thought they might be able to find information on Susan's case, and they also found much more than they bargained for. Not in Josh Powell's room, but in Steve Powell's room. In Steve Powell's room, they found a cabinet. And inside this cabinet, they found Steve's weird little treasure box of Susan. They found photos upon photos upon photos of Susan. Photos that looked as if they had been taken without her knowledge. Close-ups of her body parts. They also had video of the same close-ups of her, things that she clearly didn't know he was taken. Videos of her walking to and from work where he's zooming in on her face and her breasts and her legs. Voyeurism at its finest. This cabinet also held Susan's clothes, the dirty clothes that he would steal from the hamper when she lived with him, including bags dated with her dirty underwear and her used lady month. They're her pads, her used pads. He would put them in bags and he would date them, and God knows he probably sniffed them like a creep, okay? And he had these in there. And he also had journals upon journals upon journals. 10, I believe, journals filled with nothing but writings of Susan and a bunch of music. Steve was a musician and he wrote a lot of songs about Susan and his love for Susan. I've heard some of these. They're not good. Unfortunately, Susan wasn't the only person who Steve had been taking photos of. And this is incredibly upsetting. But in looking into Steve's cabinet, they found photos, clearly voyeuristic photos of 2 little girls, tiny little girls, taking baths, getting dressed, just being children. And it was determined that these photos had been taken from the upstairs floor in the Powell house into the house across the way into the girls' bedroom and bathroom. So police could tell by looking at these girls that they were underage, but of course they had to prove it. And they did. They ended up finding out that these girls were very young. One, I believe, was 10 and one was under 10. And when the girl's mother found out, as you can imagine, she was mortified because she had never considered that her daughters would be unsafe in their bathroom on the 2nd floor. She never considered that somebody would have been able to look at them there. She didn't expect to have a creep for a neighbor, so. These 2 young girls were not the only young girls that police then found out Steve Powell had an infatuation with. Remember how I told you he had written some inappropriate things about his daughter, Jennifer? Well, they found then that he had written about a time when him and Jennifer had went on a road trip together, and during this road trip he had shown her a dirty movie, which is just like, this is all when she's underage. And then he then wrote about his intense arousal he had while being alone in a room with her while she hung out in her t-shirt and panties, like a little girl does with her daddy, I imagine. But it just seems like a totally normal and like innocent experience that this guy was just an animal. Steve Powell was arrested and Charlie and Braden were subsequently removed from the home because Josh was living with his boys under the roof of this monster, and they could not prove that the boys were not affected by this sick creep and that Josh was not, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Complicit in his father's crimes. So with some distance between Charlie and Braden and the Powells, it was clear that these boys had been fed some pretty interesting information and ideologies from the warped minds of the Powell family. The boys talked about how God was bad and Mormons were bad and that their mom was dead. The boys didn't appear to have been going to bed at a certain bedtime, and when the 2 did sleep, they slept naked, which is really weird considering what we know. And they ate like men who had just gotten out of prison. They would just grab anything they could get off the table, and the boys ended up going to stay with their grandparents, which I am sure just pissed Josh off, as this was one of his main requests, is that the children have nothing to do with Susan's parents. But again, once the kids ended up with the Coxes, it was very clear that they had some weird influences, because when they got to the Coxes' home, they asked Chuck and Judy, like, hey, are you gonna abuse us now that we're here? Which is a thing that, like, a kid, they were little. You're not gonna just ask that unless somebody's said that to you. So that's just disgusting. At a later custody hearing, Josh told the court that that first off, he wanted his kids back, but if he couldn't have his kids back, he did not want them to go with the Coxes. He would rather them be in foster care than spend any time with Susan's parents. There was just a lot of tension between the Cox and the Powell households after Susan's disappearance. Obviously, part of this was because it was so obvious to the Coxes that Josh was involved, and in addition to that, he did everything he could to ruin their frickin' missing daughter's name and to paint them as child abusers to the media. Josh and his family were very vocal about their belief that the Coxes were abusive and evil because they were Mormons. Steve Powell in particular was so aggressively anti-Mormon that there was just no way that he was ever going to accept and like the Coxes. Steve Powell just thought that Mormons in general were like bad and evil, and he had no issue with expressing this, particularly where the Coxes were involved. As I said before, the Powells used or made the excuse that these journals of Susan's were evidence of this, and it just wasn't a good look. And in addition to that, after an altercation between Josh and Susan's parents at, I believe it was like a department store, Josh ended up actually getting a restraining order against Susan's dad. So it was just like overall not a good look, not a good vibe between the two families. And so I'm sure he was just absolutely thrilled when the court allowed Chuck and Judy to have custody of his kids. Either way, the judge disagreed with Josh's request and the kids were kept in the Cox household. Josh was also informed that he would have one supervised visitation every week, which would take place on Sundays because Josh didn't want his kids to go to church at all, so he chose Sundays so the kids wouldn't go to church with the Coxes. Josh was also informed that he had to move out of Steve Powell's home, get his own place, and undergo a psychological evaluation in order to determine his parental competency. That sentence was really good. Initially, during this psychological evaluation, Josh seemed pretty normal to the person who was administering it, but it didn't take long for that sort of mask to slip, and the man who was conducting the evaluation noticed that Josh's words felt very controlled, carefully chosen, and likely insincere, and that he seemed pretty disconnected in general from his emotions. Josh did end up moving out of Steve Powell's home, and he rented himself a large house that was pretty close to his boys' school. And though initially the visitations were at a neutral location, after a bit of time it was determined that Josh could have his visits at his own home. So behind the scenes, things started to happen pretty quickly for police after Steve was arrested and the kids were taken from Josh's care. First, like I said, the boys were allowed to see Josh at his home instead of at a neutral location. And the court had actually suggested that Josh start taking steps towards reunification with his sons, which was odd because the psychological examiner who had examined Josh actually did not think that reunification was a good idea at this point, and instead maybe they should just try giving him a few extra visitations a week. They didn't think it was a good idea for them to be back together as a family yet. And while all of this was happening, investigators had been working on getting into Josh's computers and hard drives, and they were able to get into one. And what they found was some sensitive material that showed that maybe Josh Powell wasn't that different from his father, Steve Powell, after all, if you know what I'm saying. These images that were recovered from the hard drives and computers, the documents were sent from authorities in Utah to authorities in Washington, and this completely changed things for Josh, who had just now been thinking he was going to be able to reunite his family and get his kids back. Instead, he was told, sorry, bro, you're not going to get your kids back for a while. And on top of that, you need to now take a psychosexual evaluation to determine, what types of things turn you on sexually. They do tests to check that and to see if you're a danger to others based on those preferences. Josh did not end up going through with this psychosexual evaluation. However, instead, he spent the next couple of days going to the bank, pulling out some funds and transferring the rest to his family. He also started to remove and donate items from his home. He also went to a storage unit and took items out of there to donate as well. This included his son's toys and his son's books. He then sent out some emails, one of which was to his youngest sister, sending her some financial documents, passwords, things to handle his finances in the event that he was no longer there, and then he started calling and leaving voicemails saying his goodbyes. Sunday, February 5th, 2012, at approximately 12 p.m., Elizabeth, the woman who was appointed to take Charlie, who was then 7 years old, and Braden, who was then 5 years old, to their scheduled visit with their father, pulled into the driveway of Josh Powell's new home in Washington. Once she parked the car, the two boys, excited to see their dad, jumped out and ran to the front door where their dad was waiting and ran right past him into the house. Elizabeth didn't think this was weird. Why should she? This is just something that kids do. They're excited. They're ready to start their day. As Elizabeth approached the door, she looked Josh right in the eyes. He looked right in her eyes, and he closed the door in her face, locking it, not letting her inside. So she starts banging on the door, freaking out, like, let me in. I have to be in there. You know I have to be in there. And she starts listening. And from inside, she hears first Josh say, "Boys, I've got a surprise for you," which is just absolutely chilling to me. And then she hears crying from inside from one of the boys. After several minutes of hearing the crying and her banging, she started to notice that she smelled gasoline. So Elizabeth ran to her car and she dialed 911. And this call, man, is the most frustrating thing you'll ever hear in your life. I suggest going on YouTube and listening to it if you just want to be in a bad mood afterwards, because I listened to it several times and I listened to it again in preparation for my notes for this case, and every single time I hear it I get so mad because the operator is such a condescending fuck. I'm sorry, but he was, and I did read that he was reprimanded for it because he had, and I quote, failed to recognize several department policies when handling this call. Fucking putting it lightly. He was just really dismissive and inattentive, and when the social worker wasn't sure on the address because she drove there on autopilot, he was like, okay, well, that's kind of important for me to know, like that kind of attitude. After Elizabeth had informed this dispatcher that the kids were inside, that she smelled gasoline, and that she thought they were in danger, she asked him, how long do you think it'll take before an officer gets here? And he said, and this is gonna make you so mad, I don't know, ma'am. They have to respond to emergency, life-threatening situations first. And I am certain that that statement haunts him considering what happens. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it's this guy's fault what happened, because it's 100% Josh's fault. But if police had gotten there sooner, things may have been different. And that is just the truth. Elizabeth had decided that she was going to move her car across the street because she was worried about the smell of gasoline. And as she sat at her car across the street, she saw the home explode into flames. The flames moved so quickly through the house that it sounded like an explosion because of the gasoline that Josh had splashed around his home, the home containing him and his two young sons. Josh and his two sons, 7-year-old Charlie and 5-year-old Braden, were found in a back bedroom with a hatchet laying next to their bodies. Josh had taken a hatchet to his two small sons before setting the house on fire, but the hatchet was not what killed the boys. The cause of death was inhaling the smoke from the fire. It's theorized that besides Josh just snapping in the situation, which I do believe part of this was that he snapped, I really do, like, he was coming down on him. The police knew that he did it, and he was losing his kids, and I have to imagine that he thought, allegedly, that by getting rid of Susan, it would improve his life, but instead things were just falling down around him. Things just weren't going the way he had planned. And it was also said that the kids were starting to kind of turn on their dad. They were still happy to like see him and they loved him. I mean, as evidence of them getting out of the car and running to him. But Chuck and Judy Cox said the morning that they were going to go over and see their dad, they didn't even want to go. That they said they didn't want to go, but there was a court order, so they had to let the kids go. The boys were also just getting more vocal and seemed like that maybe they were starting to remember things more clearly. Charlie had started to talk and say things that were kind of interesting, like that his mommy had come camping with them and that she was in the trunk, and that when they got there, his mommy and daddy both got out of the car, but only his daddy came back. There was also a drawing done by Braden, the younger of the two boys, and in the drawing, it showed him, his brother, and his dad, and when Chuck Cox, Susan's dad, asked, like, oh, where's your mommy? He said that she was in the trunk. The two boys were buried in one casket with one headstone. It had their birth dates and death dates. Charlie was born January 19th, 2005, and died February 5th, 2012. Braden was born January 2nd, 2007, and died February 5th, 2012. And at the bottom it said, Susan, born October 16th, 1981, missing December 6th, 2009. And at the top there was a photo of Susan and her boys surrounded by angels. Initially, Josh's family had the audacity to be pissed because they thought that Josh should be buried with his sons, the sons that he murdered. Obviously, that's crazy, and that didn't end up happening. Shortly after the murder-suicide, like almost immediately after, Josh's siblings tried to claim his life insurance, which, technically speaking, they were considered beneficiaries, but Susan Cox, or Susan Powell, Susan, was still listed as the primary beneficiary, and technically speaking, Susan was missing, not dead, so this caused some issues. And I know I keep going back and forth between Susan Cox and Susan Powell. I'm sorry, they're both her names. 3 months after the death of Josh and his boys, Steve Powell, you know, the one who's in jail for his dirty, nasty, voyeuristic photos, well, he had his trial, and though his attorney did his very best, I don't know what he could have possibly done to get him off, Steve Powell was found guilty. On February 12, 2013, just over a year after Josh killed himself and his boys, Josh's brother Michael, the one who had the car who was towed where the cadaver dogs hit on the trunk, well, 30-year-old Michael took his own life by jumping off a 7-story structure in Minnesota. Steve Powell was released from prison in July of 2017 after serving 7 years. He died a year later, almost exactly on July 23rd, 2018, of natural causes. So where are we now? A woman is missing and presumed dead because honestly at this point, if she had left on her own, which I just find to be highly unlikely, she would have come back by now. When her kids were killed, she would have come back. Something would have popped up at this point. It just doesn't seem likely to me at all that she upped and left. She might have been wildly unhappy, but she loved her sons and she always tried to make it work despite how shitty Josh Powell was. And let's just call it what it is. In my opinion, Josh Powell murdered his wife. That's what I think. If it wasn't already clear to you, I think what he did to his sons is a pretty good indicator of his guilt. Speaking of the boys, Susan's parents actually ended up suing the State Department of Social and Health Services because their negligence contributed to the death of both Charlie and Braden. The trial began in February of 2020, so just last year, and it ended with Susan's parents being rewarded just over $98 million. Which good. And Chuck Cox, Susan's father, said of the verdict, and I quote here, "Nothing can bring the boys back, but this is the end of a nightmare, and it's gratifying to hear a jury tell the state that they were wrong. And to award a verdict that will force them to change the culture at DHS to ensure that this doesn't happen to any other children in the future." So where does that leave us now? With an entire family gone. With Josh killing his kids, and if I'm right about his involvement, he took all of his secrets to his grave, along with Steve Powell and Michael Powell, who I low-key, high-key allegedly think had something to do with it, at least with the cover-up after the fact. Police have worked incredibly hard to try to locate Susan's body. They searched at the campsite where Josh and the boys were said to have been camping that night. They also searched in Utah's West Desert because that's where the abandoned mine shafts are that Josh had said that would be like the best place to hide a body because of how unstable they are and how difficult they were to search, but nothing useful was found in those locations. The issue is that Susan could be kind of anywhere, right? Like there's so many unaccounted for hours with Josh. First, overnight when he left for that camping trip, the day that he was gone waiting, with police waiting at his house for him to come back, and then the day he had gotten that rental car, he put 1,000 miles on that car. And in addition, if Michael was involved, his brother, the one whose trunk was hit by cadaver dogs, who's to say where he could have taken her? No one knows where he had been. She could be anywhere. You know, and so many people who were likely allegedly involved are dead now, and maybe Josh's other siblings know, but maybe not. He might have just never even told them. The only other lead that police really have at this point is the electronics and the hard drives that were taken from the home that Josh and Susan shared together, and also the home that Josh and Steve later shared together. Police ended up taking a ton of electronics from both homes, computers, hard drives, things like that, because Josh and his whole family were really big on electronics and computers and stuff, and police do believe that these could hold the key to locating Susan's body, because it is generally believed that she is dead. The problem is that all of Josh's devices were encrypted, and the police did ask Josh for these passwords, but he said that he didn't remember them. Okay, Josh, sure. He later admitted on a wiretap that he did, but whatever. And so police have had to just try to break into them themselves, and they had no luck. So they actually asked the court for permission to send the devices to the FBI lab in Quantico to see if they had any luck breaking the codes. The FBI had no luck. They even asked for help from the Secret Service. The Secret Service had no luck breaking into Josh Powell's computers. The last report I saw about this is that they were still trying to get into his devices in 2018, which is just so wild to me that the Secret Service and the FBI couldn't get into this random little dudes' computers, but that's where we're at, and that's the latest I saw, and it's just crazy because, like, maybe if they get into them, it could hold some information, but honestly, maybe it could be literally nothing. There's no way to know until we're inside. The thing is that Josh and his family, they were pack rats. They kept everything, not just physically, but also electronically. They scanned everything into their computers. Every piece of paper they ever got, receipts, bills, financial stuff, everything was scanned into a computer, their journals. So even though it seems like all of these things are so filled with information, it could be filled with literally nothing. And we can't get in to find out. And even once we are in, it could take forever to sort through, and it may not even be anything relevant, which is just incredibly frustrating. But that, my friends, is the story of the Powell family tragedies. I know that that was a lot to take in, but I still ask you, what do you think? This case just really upsets me. It's this one that just gets into my head and I can't get out. I've looked into it extensively. I've listened to the Cold podcast not constantly, but I've listened to it several times. And it's always the case that I recommend to people and they're like, what case should I look into? I'm like, the Powell case. And I recommend the Cold podcast all the time because I just find it to be, one, incredibly interesting, and two, just so tragic and avoidable. And like, I really do think that Josh killed Susan, and I don't know why. I mean, I guess I do know why he wasn't arrested, because they didn't really have like proof. It was all circumstantial, but it's just like so frustrating. And it's just like, I don't know if we'll ever actually get this officially solved. Like, everyone kind of thinks that Josh did it, but even if they were to find her body on a whim, you know that bodies get found freaking decades later all the time. Because it's been so long, there might not be any evidence, and even if there was, like, people who are likely involved are already dead, so there's no like closure there. And I just feel so bad for her parents, because to not know, like, I'm pretty sure they're still alive and they probably will die sadly before they ever really know what happened to their daughter. And I mean, I'm sure that they like know, you know, they know that she's gone and they know that he probably did it, but to never know for sure, to have it confirmed and to be able to get her back and lay her to rest is just so heartbreaking. And I just don't know how they could even, I don't know how anyone goes on after something like that. Not just losing your child, but losing both of your grandchildren. I can't fathom that pain. It's so tough. How could Josh do that? How could any living person do that to another living person, let alone your own kids? 5 and 7. They were actual babies, dude. And he took a hatchet to these little boys. And then that didn't even kill them. They had to lay there in pain, hopefully unconscious, and die from smoke inhalation. What kind of actual monster was this man? And I just can't imagine what would be going through his head while he did something like that. Like, okay, maybe he was really worried that the police were onto him, and maybe he was really worried about what would come out in that psychosexual evaluation. Maybe he thought he'd lose his kids forever. So kill yourself. Why did you have to take the boys with you? It just feels very much to me like, if I can't have you, no one can. And that's fucked up. And it also, I don't know why I like muted the so and said the F word. Sorry, I'm cussing a lot. This case makes me upset. But it could either be that, or maybe this sicko really, really believed that the Coxes and Mormons were so evil that he had to take them to save them from this world. Honestly, who knows, man? No one. No one can know, because they're all dead and Susan's gone. And that's just very sad. Just, people need to just like do better and be better. Things like this should not happen. Anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope that you found this case interesting and that my videos, my 2 parts, were informative and gave you every bit of information you'd want when looking into this case. I know that it was really long. I can't even imagine how long this one is compared to the first one. I already edited the first one and it was 45 minutes. So I can't even imagine how long this one is, because I know I've been filming longer. So I hope that you stuck with me. If you did, leave like a heart so I know that you are a real one. And of course, I hope that you enjoyed what I'm putting out, because I put out things that I find interesting and what I would want to exist into the world. So it means a lot to me that you like it. And thank you for just being here to remember Susan and her freaking boys today, because they're definitely worth remembering. We don't need to remember Josh Powell. Please let me know of any cases you would like to see me cover down below, because I have a long, long list, as I've told you before, of cases that I plan to cover. But every time you leave one, I add the case and your name so I can give you a shout out, because I know you're filled with good taste and good ideas. Otherwise, you would not be here. Of course, make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new Morbid makeup video every single week, and I would love to hang out with you, specifically you. Yes, you. And if you want to hang out more consistently, Instagram and Brad are seen are where I'm most active, but I also made a Facebook group and a Facebook page per request of some subscribers, so you can check those out as well. I'm going to put it all on the screen, and then I'll start putting it in the description box as well for your convenience. And with all of that said, thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That's tight, you're tight. Please stay safe and just be better than you were yesterday. And I hope to see you in my next video.